I am Kimberly Lavelle at yourparenthelp.com, and if you go to yourparenthelp.com/reading comprehension, you can get my free download that goes over 8 strategies. It's called the Octopus's Guide to Reading. So it's 8 strategies to teach reading comprehension, and they're kind of fun, casual strategies. So it's not anything that requires any particular curriculum, just whatever you're reading, things you can do. Today we're going to be diving into the first of those, and I call it a double read because we should be at least double, but think of that as the minimum. More tends to be better, unless you get to a point where you or your child are zoning out, don't care anymore, it feels tedious, it feels unenjoyable. Reading should always be enjoyable, because if it's not enjoyable, then nobody's really learning. So we definitely want to make it enjoyable, and that's kind of the goal of a lot of the strategies, is to make it enjoyable and accessible for everyone. So, when I'm reading to my 2-year-old, he wants to read the same book over and over and over and over, because toddlers automatically know something about the way the brain works. The more he hears it, the more he learns it, the more he understands it, the more he remembers it. And it can be a familiar comfort, but it's good to read that same thing over and over. When I'm reading something, every time I read through it, I read it a little bit differently. I notice something a little bit different about it. So, the first time I read it, I think I understand it, and then I read it again and go, oh, I didn't notice that little nuance. And then I read it again, I might get something else out of it. And if you notice, sometimes 2 people read the same thing and you have a discussion and one person got something completely different than you did. And a third person might have something else completely different. So reading through something multiple times really helps us understand it. Now, I would recommend, when you're doing this with your child, if you're reading out loud to them, read through the entire text once. Now, if it's an entire novel, you're not going to read through the entire thing and then go back and start again, usually, unless you want to, or your child would like that. Usually it might be an entire page, an entire conversation, like dialogue between characters, maybe even an entire chapter, depending on how long the chapters are, and then go back and reread it. Novels can be a little bit tricky. You might want to just read through it and discuss as you go, because you don't want to take away from the enjoyment of just reading it. But if you're trying to dig deeper as you're reading through it, then it helps to reread sections. And maybe you don't reread the whole thing, but you reread portions that you thought were really deep, or you really want your child to understand this paragraph or something. Now, most of the time you're going to be working on an excerpt or an article or a picture book with younger kids, and you can literally read the entire thing and then go back and chunk it. The second time you read it, the third time you read it in chunks, so that they get the whole scope of what the whole story is about, the whole intent, the whole passage is about. What is the main idea, the main topic, the plot? And a lot of it is, read it to enjoy it, read it to learn from it, read it to be impacted by it in whatever way the author intended. Then you're going back the second time to dig deep. Now, if you're working on a curriculum, this is the time that you might be answering the questions about the text. A lot of us were taught that you should read the questions before you read the text so you know what to look for. I would say yes, but not before the first time you read it. Read it all the way through, then read the questions, then go back and read it and look for those answers and slow down and analyze it at that point. Because if you're only looking for those questions, then you're also missing out on just the enjoyment of that text. So, you read through it all the way, chunk it up, answer whatever questions if you're working on a specific curriculum, or if you're just reading with your child, you're asking them questions as you go. And it depends on your where they're at as to what types of questions you might be asking. It might be very basic. Who is in the story? What does it look like? It might be something deeper where you're trying to analyze. It might be about making connections. Oh, what does that remind you of? What does that make you think of? So it depends. I would encourage to always try for as high as you can, but or reflect. If you're not sure that your child can make that, like, what does that remind you of? You can say, oh man, that really makes me think about this morning when we were eating breakfast, and whatever it reminds you of. So we read it all the way through for enjoyment. We read it again when we're chunking. If you're reading aloud to your kid. If your child is reading to themselves, I would say again at least twice, but it might look a little different. If your child is struggling to read, so they're not just working on comprehension, they're actually working on phonics or decoding or fluency in some way, they're struggling through actually reading the words, then you want them to read it, and it's going to be slow, and so they're not going to be able to read through the whole thing once to enjoy it. That'll probably come at the very end. So it's kind of the opposite. They're then starting with struggling through it, practicing it to get a little bit more fluent. Okay, now they're fluent. Now they can hear it for its meaning. And after they've heard it for its meaning, they can kind of enjoy it. And then maybe they do have one enjoyment read before they go back and read it again and start to analyze it. Now, this can feel really, really tedious for a child. So if you're doing that, be watching for signs of fatigue. You probably want to be doing this in separate chunks so that your child maybe struggles through it, and once they're fluent or they've gotten a chunk of it or whatever, high five, great job, we're going to come back to this later today. And then later you come back to it, read it again, and get more fluent. And then later we come back and try to understand it. And maybe that third or fourth time, you're the one reading it to them when they're trying to just understand the text. So they've already struggled through reading it, but then the piece where they're reading it and trying to comprehend, answer questions about it, you want to be the one that is reading it to them sometimes. Some kids don't work as well if they aren't the ones reading it to themselves, and sometimes they just don't need it or don't want it, but it's something to think about and watch for. Even if you're the one reading to your child the entire time, which if you're just working on comprehension, I think is fine. Your child doesn't have to be the one reading it, even if they're reading at a 6th grade level and they're reading the text. That's what they're working on. Oh, they could read it themselves. Yeah, they could. But some kids enjoy listening to it instead, and I don't think it hurts their comprehension to be hearing it versus reading it. It does use the brain a little bit differently, and some kids do better when they hear it, and some kids do better if they read it themselves, so pay attention to that difference, and ask your child to reflect on that themselves also, so that they recognize which one works better for them. And if you're the one reading it to your child, that's what I was starting to say, if you're the one reading it to your child, you might want to also still chunk it up. So you read through it once just for enjoyment, then you notice your kids are like, okay, I'm over it. I need a break. We've been working for 10 minutes. I need a break. I'm going to take a break. An hour or two later, come back to it, read it again, and maybe for enjoyment again. Maybe they need to hear it all the way through again. They still, didn't totally understand it. Maybe you take another break, and then an hour or two later, you do it again, or the next day you do it again, and then maybe you're chunking it up. At some point, then you might be chunking it into looking for an answer. Most curriculums, if they're giving you questions that you're supposed to answer about a text, they go in order. Not always. Sometimes they're not very nice. But most of the ones that I've used do go in order, so you can look at the first question. You don't have to remember all 10 questions that you're looking for. You just look for the first question, look for that answer, go back. Sometimes the last couple of questions might be more broad picture where you have to kind of go back and understand the whole thing, and you might have to reread the entire text to get a really good understanding for that answer, in which case you might need to answer those last 1 or 2 questions at a whole separate time. So don't try to complete an entire assignment in one sitting. Just try to complete what makes sense to complete for your child's brain capacity. I'll say it a million times probably. People, not just kids, typically only have an attention span of 10 minutes. So if you're working for more than 10 minutes with your child, you probably need to stop and go take a break, come back to it later. And this video is now just over 10 minutes, so I'll let you take a break, and I will see you next week. Again, yourparenthelp.com/reading comprehension to get that download of the 8 strategies, and you'll be able to subscribe to the newsletter so that you know all about these videos every time they drop. Yourparenthelp.com, and I'm Kimberly Lavelle. Have a great week.